Welcome to the World Class Speaking podcast series. This is a place where you will learn how to present, persuade, and profit by improving your communication skills. Each episode in the series is a chapter from the book World Class Speaking in Action. And each chapter is written by a certified world class speaking coach. I'm your host, Matt Miller, and I've carefully crafted and summarized each chapter in the book. If you are only worried about not making a mistake, then you will communicate absolutely nothing. You will have missed the point of making music, which is to make people feel something. It's all about making people care what happens next. And that's a quote by Yo-Yo Ma. Now substitute the word speaking for the phrase making music, and this quote equally applies to speakers. You absolutely must connect emotionally with your audience, and in this episode, we will show you how to do just that. This episode is part 4 of the series, World Class Speaking Delivery. And it is episode 19, Upholding the Grand Bargain, Why You Must Connect Emotionally with Your Audience. And it's by David P. Oatley. And David P. Oatley is a certified world-class speaking coach, as well as an inspirational speaker, expert of presenting, storytelling, and persuasion. So why is this episode so important? Well, you must connect emotionally with your audience if you want your information to be remembered. You want your message to make a difference, and you want to be invited back to speak again. Someone who I think is one of the best presenters and speakers when it comes to connecting emotionally with their audience is my favorite podcast host, Ed Mylett. He is a New York Times bestselling author, highly desired keynote speaker, coach, trainer, and I got the opportunity to see him speak in Columbus, Ohio, or maybe Cincinnati, Ohio. It was at a Life Surge event. And the Life Surge event is basically where they bring in a bunch of different speakers. And throughout the entirety of the day, probably about 8 hours, there's different speakers that speak on investing. Some speak on real estate, and then others speak on different ways to build wealth. But the core theme of the Life Surge event is people that have a strong faith. And that's someone who Ed Mylett is. He has a strong faith. So he does this event, and he probably does it for not a whole lot of money, but it's more about the cause for him. And because of this, I was able to get tickets. They're not very expensive to go to a Life Surge event. And I got to see him speak. And he gave one of the most emotionally connecting speeches that I think the audience had ever heard. And you could tell by the people in the audience that he connected with them emotionally. He talked about how he was growing up and he had an alcoholic father. And he talked about how at a young age that he had to take care of his family when his dad went out and started drinking. And then he connected with the audience and had them think about their lives, about something that was challenging or a trouble that they were going through. And by him telling his story, he got the audience to reflect on their own lives. And you could tell that in the audience, he was the best speaker. He did an incredible job. And I could definitely see why he was such a highly paid speaker. But that's the power of emotional storytelling and speaking, is you get the audience to remember it. That's the one thing for Life Surge that I'll always probably remember, because it's something that resonated deeply with me. And when you are telling an emotional story and connecting with the audience, it all starts with purpose. You must make a difference in your audience's life. After the audience hears you speak, there should be some kind of changed behavior or some changed action, and that would make you know that you made a difference in their life. And in order to make a difference, it requires the audience to do 3 things. So number 1, they have to accept what you say. They have to take your information and accept it as true. And then number 2, they have to remember it. You have to paint that picture in their head so that they remember it after the event is over. And then number 3, they have to act on it. And then that's a changed life. If they accept what you say, they remember it, and they act on it. And then in order for your audience to accept what you have to say, remember it, and act on it, they will be asking themselves a series of 3 questions. Number 1 is, will I allow this new information to displace what I already know and think? Number 2, is it worth committing this to memory? And then number 3, will I take action And in order to get the audience to say yes to these three questions, we must connect with them emotionally. And now I'm going to read a paragraph directly from the book. What we know about decision making, thanks to new advances in neuroscience, is that it takes place in the emotional part of the brain. We may weigh the merits of an argument in our rational brain, but we ultimately make decisions with our emotional brain. That means even if something logically makes sense, such as purchasing a car, maybe we find it for a good price, we won't end up pulling the trigger until we are emotionally sold. That's why we must connect emotionally. And I thought this was really interesting to just think about all the decisions that we make throughout a daily basis. A lot of times it makes sense logically, it makes sense on paper, it makes sense financially. But if we can't come to grips emotionally and accept it, then chances are we're not going to move forward with the decision, because a lot of times we end up going with our gut. We go with overall how we feel. Now, jumping back to emotional storytelling, we must connect emotionally if we want to accomplish our purpose. And there's 6 things described in the book that we can do that will help us connect emotionally. So number 1, don't be perfect. Share share imperfect stories, because people relate with your struggles and your challenges more than they'll relate with your successes and triumphs. People don't want to hear that you're a millionaire, that you own all these real estate properties, and that you've made it in investing. People want to hear the challenges and the struggles that you went through in order to get to that point, because that's what they can learn from. Then number 2 is share the struggle. Everybody goes through struggles to get where they're at. If you can save your audience that pain and use it for their gain, that means it's going to be the most connecting with the audience. And then number 3 is when you're connecting emotionally, you want to speak emotionally. You want to have passion, but you also want to use emotion and use vocal variety. And there's certain times when you're telling a story that you want to be loud and proud. And then there's other times when you're making a different point that you want to slow down and you want to be softer spoken. If you can master how to speak to the words that you're speaking to, you're going to connect more with your audience. Then number 4 is get the audience to reflect on their own lives. I talked about this with the story of Ed Mylett speaking. He was a master at getting the audience to think about their own lives through the story that he told. If you can do that, then you're going to get the audience to remember it because they're reflecting on their own life. Then number 5 is being passionate and showing credibility. If you can show that you've been through the challenge and this is where I am today and this is how I got through it, or you can show how many years you spent doing something or the challenges that you overcame. And then if you can all speak that through the lens of passion, that's going to help you connect emotionally with your audience as well. Then number 6, in order to connect emotionally, is to be likable. Whenever you start speaking, within the first 7 seconds, they will determine whether or not they like you. That's the cold, hard truth. And then within 30 seconds, they're going to determine whether or not they even want to continue listening to you. That's why it's so important to be likable. And if we can do those 6 things, then we will connect emotionally with our audience. Another thing that I found fascinating about the book is that we speak much slower than we actually read. That means if we give a presentation, we have to give the audience more than just information, because realistically, we could just hand the audience our script and they could read it in much less time. And here's a direct quote from the book. You must respect your audience's time. The average English speaker speaks at a rate of 125 to 150 words per minute. The average adult reading speed is twice that. That means if you were to write down a 30-minute keynote speech and hand it to me, I could probably read it in 15 minutes or less. Not only could I consume the information in half the time, but once you've handed it to me, I can read it in any 15 minutes of my choosing, instead of having to work my schedule around yours. This means that you must be willing to bring something else to the table. You must bring emotional engagement. You must bring the ability to draw your listeners into your stories so they completely feel what your characters feel. You must be able to have the audience connect with you and connect with each other to ultimately make it worth the time they spend listening to you. To summarize a few key takeaways from this chapter is that decisions and memories are both made in the emotional part of the brain. If you want your message to be accepted and remembered, then you must meet the audience at an emotional level. Second, the audience does not owe you their attention. They pay it to you when you earn it. And then number 3, when you move your audience from hearing your stories to actually feeling them, you'll make a difference. And that is why you speak. To summarize, making a difference requires your audience to do the following 3 things. 1, accept what you have to say. 2, remember it. And 3, act on it. And then there's 6 different things that we can do to connect emotionally. 1 is to share personal, imperfect stories. 2 is to share the struggle. 3 is to use emotion and vocal variety. 4 is to get the audience to reflect on their lives. 5 is to be passionate, incredible. And 6 is to be likable. Now that you know the importance of connecting with your audience at an emotional level, I encourage you to think how you will sell your main topics to your audiences emotionally first before presenting the facts, figures, and logic. Because decision making always takes place in the emotional part of the brain. That wraps up this episode, and in the next episode, you will learn the clap formula to increase audience engagement. That's all we've got for this episode on the World Class Speaking podcast series. Until next time, remember that becoming a great communicator is so important because it leads to greater impact, influence, and income. Thank you for listening and have a great day.